Marcus Sterling signed the papers that would betray his wife while she sat 3 rooms away carrying his child. He didn't hesitate, didn't pause, just scrawled his name across the bottom of a document that redirected $3 million from their joint holdings into a private account only he and Chloe knew existed. And then he straightened his tie and walked downstairs to kiss Elena on the cheek, like a man who had never done anything wrong in his life. If you've ever watched someone smile at you while holding the knife behind their back, you already know how this story ends. Stay with me until the last second, subscribe to the channel, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Marcus Sterling was the kind of man who had never once, in 42 years of living, been told that he had gone too far. Not by his board, not by his investors, not by the press who called him visionary and fearless and self-made in the same breath, and certainly not by Elena, who had stood beside him through every version of himself. He had ever been the scrappy startup kid with maxed-out credit cards, the reluctant middle manager who swore he was meant for more, the overnight success story that Silicon Valley loved to photograph. She had been there for all of it, quiet, steady, asking for almost nothing. That Marcus had long since decided was the problem with Elena. She asked for nothing, which meant he had stopped bothering to offer anything. It was a Tuesday in October when the first crack appeared, though Marcus would not recognize it as a crack until much later, when the whole structure had already fallen on top of him. He came home at 11:15 that night, later than usual, still wearing the faint trace of Chloe's perfume on his collar. It wasn't carelessness on his part, not exactly. It was something worse. It was indifference. He had simply stopped caring whether Elena noticed. In his mind, she had settled into a comfortable and permanent role, the background of his life, the warm furniture of his success present, without demanding to be seen. He expected to find her asleep. He expected the soft lamp in the bedroom to be on the way. She always left it on for him. And he expected to feel the familiar low guilt that he had trained himself to ignore within seconds of walking through the door. What he did not expect was silence. Not the silence of a sleeping woman. A different silence entirely. The kind that has weight to it, that presses against your ears and makes the air feel thicker than it should. Marcus stood in the entrance of the house for a full 10 seconds before he moved. He told himself later that it was nothing, that he was tired, and reading the air wrong, that the house was always quiet at this hour. He walked into the kitchen. The counter was clean. No half-filled glass of water with her prenatal vitamins beside it. No open book face down on the island counter. Those were the small routines he had memorized without meaning to, the tiny signals that confirmed someone else existed in his space. He walked upstairs. The bedroom lamp was off. He turned on the light and stood at the edge of the room looking at the bed. Made. Perfectly made. Not slept in. Elena. His voice came out quieter than he intended. He cleared his throat and said it again, louder this time, with the authority he used in boardrooms when a conversation needed redirecting. Nothing. He checked the bathroom. Empty. The counter was wrong. Her moisturizer was gone. The specific one she had special ordered and complained was impossible to replace. He stood there staring at the empty space where it had always sat, and for the first time something small and cold moved through him. He told himself she had probably gone to her sister's, Diane, who lived 40 minutes away, and had always treated Marcus with the kind of polite hostility that he returned with cheerful condescension. Elena went there occasionally when things between them were tense. He reached for his phone. Diane answered on the third ring voice, thick with sleep, and immediately sharpened by something else when she heard his voice. "Is Elena with you?" he asked. A pause. Too long to be nothing. "No," Diane said. "Why, is something wrong?" "I'm sure she just forgot to leave a note," Marcus said. "Don't worry about it." He hung up before Diane could ask another question. He stood in the hallway outside the bedroom and called Elena's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording was calm and warm, and he had heard it so many times it had stopped meaning anything to him until right now in this empty house it landed in his chest with unexpected force. He called again. Voicemail. He sent a text, then a second one, then a third, each one a degree sharper than the last, the tone sliding from casual to demanding in the way that had always worked before the implicit pressure of his impatience that Elena had always responded to within minutes because she knew what happened when he had to wait. Nothing came back. Marcus walked into the nursery. He didn't go there often. In fact, he had made a point of avoiding it because the nursery represented a conversation he had been slowly, deliberately postponing, what his life was going to look like with a child in it, what it was going to cost him in terms of attention and presence, and the kind of emotional availability he had never once managed to supply to anyone who needed it. Elena had decorated the room herself quietly and without making a production of it, and Marcus had walked past the door dozens of times without stopping. He stopped now. The room was empty. Not empty the way it was before she had started furnishing it. Empty in a different surgical way. The small dresser she had assembled herself was still there, but the drawers were open and bare. The hanging mobile she had put above the crib was gone. The crib itself was still in the room, but the bedding, the tiny folded blankets, the stuffed animals she had placed against the corner rail, gone. Marcus stood in the center of that room and felt something he had not felt since he was 7 years old and had come home from school to find his father's car no longer in the driveway. He felt the specific electric horror of understanding that something has ended without asking your permission. He called his assistant Kevin at 11:45 at night without thinking twice about the hour. Kevin answered immediately because that was what Kevin did, and Marcus said, "I need you to pull Elena's location from the car tracker, right now." A pause. Typing. Then Kevin's voice careful and flattened. "Mr. Sterling, the tracking app is showing the vehicle as stationary, but there's a problem. The GPS module has been disabled." "Disabled," Marcus repeated. "Yes, sir, manually. The signal was cut approximately, more typing 6 hours ago, at a gas station off Route 18. Marcus said nothing for a long moment. "Sir, do you want me to—" "No," Marcus said. "I'll handle it." He drove to Route 18 at midnight alone, without telling anyone where he was going, because Marcus Sterling did not ask for help, and he did not admit confusion, and he certainly did not allow himself to feel what was currently moving through him as he drove something between fury and fear that he could not yet distinguish and was not sure he wanted to. He found her car in the gas station lot, unlocked, engine cold, her phone charging cable still coiled in the center console, plugged into nothing. He stood beside the open driver's door and looked inside, and then he saw it. A dark smear on the edge of the seat. Small, dried, rust brown. His first instinct was to rationalize it. She had cut her finger. She had opened something and nicked herself. He reached for the explanation the way he always reached for the interpretation that required the least amount of him. But the smear was in the wrong place for something accidental. It was at the side of the seat near the door edge, the kind of mark that would be made if someone pressed a hand there while getting out or while being helped out. He stood there looking at it for 60 seconds, and then he called the police. By 2 a.m, there were officers at the gas station. By 3, the house was a crime scene walkthrough. By 4:15, Marcus was sitting in his own living room being interviewed by a detective named Ramirez, who had the politely neutral expression of a man who had learned to give nothing away and take everything in. "When did you last see your wife, Mr. Sterling?" "This morning, before I left for work." "And what time did you leave?" 7:15. She seemed normal, no signs of distress. Marcus opened his mouth, and then for the first time in a very long time he hesitated, because he tried to summon his memory of Elena that morning and realized with a kind of quiet dread that he could not. He had looked at her and not seen her. He had been in the same room with her, and she had been as invisible to him as furniture, and now he was being asked to describe what she had looked like, and he genuinely did not know. "She seemed fine," he said, because it was the only answer he had. Ramirez wrote something down. "Mr. Sterling, are you aware of any reason your wife might have wanted to leave without telling you?" The question landed with precision. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "No," he said. "None." Ramirez looked at him for a beat longer than necessary. "And your relationship, you'd describe it as stable. We're expecting a child in 6 weeks," Marcus said. "I'd say that's fairly stable." The detective nodded slowly, in a way that communicated nothing and everything. "Of course, We'll need access to her phone records, financial accounts, any communication history you can provide. We'll also want to speak to close friends and family." "Whatever you need," Marcus said, with the practiced fluency of a man who had said whatever you need his entire life without ever once meaning it fully. Ramirez left at 5 in the morning. Marcus sat alone in the living room of a house that no longer felt like his own and stared at the wall and told himself that this was a misunderstanding. Elena had panicked about the pregnancy, about the stress of the past months, about something she had catastrophized in that quiet, internal way she had. She had staged a dramatic exit to make a point, and in a day, maybe two, she would surface and there would be a conversation and he would be firm, and she would cry and things would return to normal. He was so certain of this that he almost didn't open the voicemail. It had come in at 1:07 in the morning while he was standing at the gas station from a number he didn't recognize. He had ignored it in the moment. Now he pressed play. Elena's voice, calm, completely unnervingly calm. "Marcus, I want you to know that I am safe. I want you to know that I made this decision carefully and with full awareness of what I was choosing. I also want you to know something that I think you'll find more difficult to hear than anything else I could say." A breath, not a trembling breath, a measured one. "You have been living in a house I built, running a company I funded, wearing a life that I made possible, and you have done all of this while treating me as if I were the least significant thing in it." Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm not angry, Marcus. I want you to understand that. This isn't a breakdown. This isn't hormones or weakness or any of the other explanations I'm sure you're already assembling. This is the most clear-eyed decision I have ever made." A pause. "You'll understand more soon. Don't look for me until you're ready to understand all of it." The voicemail ended. Marcus played it again, then a third time. He sat with the phone in his hand, and the word funded pressing against the inside of his skull, like something trying to get out. And for the first time in his adult life, Marcus Sterling felt the very specific terror of not being the smartest person in the situation. His phone rang at 7:15. Kevin again. "Sir, I'm sorry to call this early, but there's something you need to see. There are 3 separate news items already running about Mrs. Sterling's disappearance. The blood in the car has been confirmed publicly. Someone at the police department talked to a reporter." Marcus closed his eyes. "There's more," Kevin said, and his voice had taken on the cautious, deliberate cadence of a man delivering something that could not be delivered gently. "Chloe has been calling the office line. She says she's been contacted by a journalist." "Chloe." Marcus said her name flatly, like a fact he was identifying. "Yes, sir. And sir, there are already comments online suggesting that you were involved in your wife's disappearance. Given that the pregnancy is public knowledge and there are now reports of blood evidence—" "I know what it looks like," Marcus said. "The board is going to call before noon," Kevin said. "What do you want me to tell them?" Marcus stared at the ceiling. Outside, the first gray light of morning was pressing through the windows. Somewhere across the city, Elena was, he didn't know where. He couldn't locate her. He had built an entire empire on the premise that he was the most powerful entity in every room he entered, and his pregnant wife had simply walked out of his life so completely and cleanly that the police couldn't find her. His tracking system had been neutralized, and her exit had been timed so precisely that he had been sitting with his mistress while it happened. She had planned this. Not in the last week, not in a panic. She had planned this the way he planned mergers months out, with contingencies, with patience. "Tell the board, I'll call them at 11, he said. He hung up and sat there in the quiet and tried very hard not to feel what he was feeling, which was the creeping, nauseating recognition that Elena, silent, invisible Elena, who asked for nothing and seemed to need less, had been watching him very carefully for a very long time. His phone buzzed. A text from Chloe. "Why am I hearing about this from a reporter? Call me now!" He looked at the text for a long moment. Then he set the phone face down on the cushion beside him and stared at nothing and said nothing. And for the first time in longer than he could measure, Marcus Sterling had absolutely no idea what to do next. The knock at the door came at 9:17. He opened it to find Ramirez again, but not alone this time. a second detective, and behind them, a woman in a gray suit who introduced herself as Sandra Cho from the Financial Crimes Division, which Marcus had not been expecting, and which caused something cold to settle across his shoulders before she had said another word. "Mr. Sterling," Ramirez said, "we have some additional questions, and I think you'll want your lawyer present for these." Marcus looked at Sandra Cho. She looked back at him without expression. "What kind of questions, T?" he said, keeping his voice even, keeping his face arranged into the controlled and cooperative expression he had deployed for press conferences and regulatory hearings and every other situation in his life where the perception of composure had been more important than the reality underneath it. "Financial questions," Sandra Cho said, "about the ownership structure of Sterling Enterprises." The cold across his shoulders moved down his spine. "I'm happy to cooperate with any questions," Marcus said. "Let me call my lawyer." He stepped back to let them in, and as he did, he caught his own reflection in the glass panel beside the door, a man in yesterday's clothes, pale, unshaved, standing in his own home while it was quietly surrounded by questions he didn't know how to answer. He had the sudden destabilizing thought that Elena had known they were coming, that she had known before he did, that she had counted on it. He pulled out his phone and called Arthur Voss, his attorney of 11 years, and as it rang, he walked toward the kitchen and away from the detectives who were now standing in his living room, looking at things with the patience of people who have already seen everything they need to see and are simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Arthur answered on the first ring. "Marcus, I know. I saw the news. I'm on my way." "There's a financial crimes detective here," Marcus said quietly, keeping his voice low and even. "Sandra Cho." Silence on the line. Not the silence of nothing, the silence of a man recalibrating very quickly. "Don't say anything," Arthur said. "Don't answer anything. Get them coffee and tell them your attorney is 3 minutes away." "Arthur," Marcus said, and his voice broke slightly on the name in a way that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had ever known him. "What does a financial crimes detective want with Sterling Enterprises?" Arthur was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Marcus," he said carefully, "when did you last look at your full ownership documentation? The complete structure, not the surface level." Marcus felt the floor shift under him slightly, the way it does in dreams when the ground becomes something unreliable. "Why?" he said. "Because," Arthur said, "I need you to be very calm when I tell you that I received something this morning, before you called. It came through my office's general inbox at 6:42 a.m. from a legal entity called the Orion Trust." The kitchen was very quiet. "The Orion Trust," Marcus repeated. "You recognize that name." It came back to him slowly, the way things do when you have deliberately chosen not to look at them. The early years, the desperate years, when Sterling Enterprises was still a series of whiteboards and borrowed time and the kind of ambition that outpaced the money to support it. There had been an angel investor, anonymous, the kind of arrangement that wasn't uncommon in the early stages, a trust that had moved capital through carefully structured channels and asked for nothing in return except a small and seemingly inconsequential stake in the company's foundational intellectual property. He had been grateful and incurious the way you are when you're drowning, and someone throws you a rope and you don't stop to ask who's holding the other end. "The Orion Trust funded our early development," Marcus said slowly. "But that was years ago. That relationship has been dormant for—" "It has not been dormant," Arthur said, and his voice had gone very quiet and very precise in the way that meant what he was about to say was going to be significant. "Marcus, the Orion Trust is not dormant. It has been active, and I am looking at documentation right now that I think you need to see before you say another word to anyone in that house." Marcus stood in the kitchen of his empty house with a financial crimes detective in his living room and his lawyer's voice in his ear and Elena's voicemail replaying at the back of his mind. "You have been living in a house I built, running a company I funded." He looked at the space on the counter where her vitamins used to sit. "Arthur," he said. "Yes." "The Orion Trust." He stopped, started again. "Tell me what you're looking at." Arthur took a breath. "Marcus, I need you to sit down." Arthur Voss had been Marcus Sterling's attorney for 11 years. He had seen Marcus navigate hostile takeovers, regulatory investigations, 2 near bankruptcies in the early years, and a shareholder lawsuit that should have ended the company before it ever went public. In all of that time, across every crisis, Marcus had walked through with the particular brand of cold-blooded calm that had made him famous. Arthur had never once heard him go silent the way he went silent now. "Marcus, are you still there?" "Keep talking," Marcus said. "The documentation the Orion Trust sent to my office this morning is extensive. We're talking about a filing that is, and I want you to understand this clearly, not a threat. It's a notification, legal, formal, and already submitted to the relevant regulatory bodies as of 6 o'clock this morning." Marcus sat down at the kitchen table. He didn't decide to sit. His legs simply made the decision for him. "What kind of notification?" "A dissolution of trust control," Arthur said. "The Orion Trust is formally withdrawing its silent partnership stake in Sterling Enterprises and converting that stake into a direct ownership claim, which means as of this morning, the entity that has been operating as a background investor in your company is now stepping forward as a primary stakeholder." Marcus pressed 2 fingers against his temple. "That's not possible. The original agreement gave the trust a minority position. 15%, that's not a controlling stake." "It's not 15%, Marcus." The kitchen felt smaller. "The original documentation you signed in the early years, the version you reviewed, was a summary document, a cover sheet. The full agreement, which was filed separately and which your previous attorney at the time signed off on, contained an escalating equity clause tied to the Apex chip development. Every milestone the chip hit commercially triggered an additional transfer of intellectual property rights back to the trust. You've hit every milestone, consecutively, for the last 6 years." Marcus said nothing. "The Orion Trust," Arthur said, "currently holds majority control of the Apex chip intellectual property. Without that, IP Sterling Enterprises doesn't have a product line. It doesn't have a valuation. It doesn't have a reason to exist in its current form." Marcus stood up so fast, the chair scraped back across the floor. "Who authorized that original filing? Who signed it on my behalf?" "Your attorney at the time, a man named Gerald Webb, who retired in 2019 and whose practice was absorbed by a firm in Portland." A pause. "Marcus, I've been going through this for the last 2 hours. The filing is clean. It's airtight. Whoever structured this knew exactly what they were doing, and they structured it to be invisible for precisely as long as it needed to be." "I want the name on the trust," Marcus said. "The actual beneficiary, not the registered agent. The person." Arthur was quiet for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to tell Marcus that this was the part he had been building toward. "The beneficial owner of the Orion Trust," Arthur said, "is listed as Elena Reyes Sterling." The name of his wife in that sentence, his wife, his quiet, invisible furniture wife, landed in Marcus's chest with the force of something structural failing, not a sharp pain, a deep one, the kind that comes from something load-bearing giving way. "That's not possible," Marcus said, and he heard how it sounded, and he hated it, hated the way his voice had lost its certainty, hated that he was standing in his own kitchen saying words that ended in possible and impossible as if reality were a negotiation. "It is possible," Arthur said, "and it is real. And Marcus, the financial crimes detective who is currently sitting in your living room, is there because the trust's dissolution filing triggered an automatic regulatory review of Sterling Enterprises' ownership structure. This isn't an investigation of you for Elena's disappearance. This is a separate matter entirely. They want to understand the equity chain." Marcus walked to the doorway between the kitchen and the living room. Ramirez was sitting on the couch, patient and still. Sandra Cho was standing near the bookshelf, and she was looking at the framed photograph on the 3rd shelf, the one from the Sterling Enterprises launch event, the company's first major product reveal the night the press had called Marcus a once-in-a-generation innovator. Elena was in that photograph standing slightly behind him, one hand resting on his arm, her expression composed and quiet-looking, not at the camera, but slightly to the left of it. Looking, Marcus now realized with a cold and specific recognition at nothing in particular, or perhaps at everything. at the room full of people celebrating an empire she had built and handed to a man who had stopped seeing her as anything other than decoration. "Tell them I'll be out in 5 minutes," Marcus said to Arthur. "And Arthur, stay on the line." He walked back into the kitchen and stood at the counter and tried to assemble himself the way he always had, the way that had carried him through every difficult moment of his professional life: controlled breathing, controlled expression, controlled voice. The architecture of a man who was never rattled. But his hands were shaking, not violently, just slightly at the fingertips, the way they do when the body knows something the mind is still refusing to process. He thought about Elena's voice on that voicemail. "You have been living in a house I built, running a company I funded." He had played it 3 times, and each time he had been certain she was speaking metaphorically, the emotional inflation of a woman who felt undervalued, reaching for language big enough to match the size of her hurt. He had heard those words and thought, she means she supported me emotionally. She means she was behind me. She means she gave up things for my career. She had meant it exactly as literally as she said it. He walked into the living room. Sandra Cho turned from the photograph. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "thank you for your patience." "Of course," he said. "I've spoken to my attorney. He'll be here shortly, and I want to be fully cooperative with whatever questions you have. I do want to note that I'm also dealing with a missing persons situation involving my wife, and—" "We're aware," Sandra Cho said, "and I want to be clear, our inquiry is separate from Detective Ramirez's investigation. We're not here about Mrs. Sterling's disappearance. We're here about Sterling Enterprises." "Specifically," Ramirez said, and leaned forward slightly, "we'd like to understand your familiarity with the Orion Trust and its relationship to your company's intellectual property holdings." Marcus looked at the two of them and made a decision. In that instant, the same kind of decision he had always made in rooms where power was being contested, where the outcome was uncertain and the stakes were total. He decided to give them the surface of the truth and protect the center of it until Arthur arrived. "The Orion Trust was an early-stage investor," he said. "Anonymous by their request. It's been largely dormant for years. I received communication this morning suggesting they're making a structural change to their position, and I'll be honest with you, I'm as surprised by that as you are." Cho and Ramirez exchanged a look. Small, calibrated. The kind of look that detectives exchange when the answer they received was exactly the answer they expected. Arthur arrived at 9:52, and after that the questions became more formal and the answers became shorter and more carefully shaped, and by 11 o'clock the detectives had what they needed for the moment and were gone with the promise of follow-up, which Marcus understood to mean, "We will be back, and next time we will bring more." Arthur spread the documents across the kitchen table. For 40 minutes neither of them spoke more than was necessary. Marcus read. Arthur pointed. Marcus read again. The full picture assembled itself with a kind of terrible elegance. The Orion Trust had been seeded with capital from an account in Elena's name, a holding account she had established through her family's estate before she and Marcus had ever met money that had existed independently of him, that had always been hers, that he had never known about because he had never asked. He had married her without asking, had built a life alongside her without asking, had assumed her background was as unremarkable as she appeared because the alternative that she was something other than what he had decided she was had simply never occurred to him as a possibility worth considering. She had brought the money to their early years under the fiction of a trust routed through an attorney named Gerald Webb, who had since conveniently retired, and she had done it quietly and without fanfare and without asking for anything in return, except the equity clauses, the escalating provisions that Marcus's original attorney had approved without fully explaining. The small print that had been sitting in a drawer for 6 years, accumulating value with every product milestone that Marcus took credit for in magazines and keynote addresses and investor presentations. She built this in, Marcus said. He wasn't asking. He was processing. From the beginning, she built herself a legal exit before she ever had a reason to use one. It appears so, Arthur said carefully. That's not a woman who panicked, Marcus said. That's not a woman who made an impulsive decision. No, Arthur agreed. She knew, from the beginning. She knew that the day might come when she needed to leave, and she made sure that when she left, she took everything with her that actually mattered. He stopped. How long have you known about this structure, the trust, the equity clauses, any of it? Arthur met his eyes steadily. "I did not know. Your previous attorney." "Gerald Webb is not my previous attorney," Marcus said, his voice going hard and flat. "He was my attorney at the time that document was signed. He was my attorney when those clauses were approved, which means he was either incompetent or compromised. Or," Arthur said quietly, "he was simply paid more by the other side." Marcus stared at him. "I'm not suggesting anything I can prove," Arthur said quickly, "but I am suggesting that whoever designed this arrangement was thorough enough to think about every possible vulnerability, including the one represented by your legal counsel." Marcus pushed back from the table. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, his hands in his pockets, looking at nothing. His phone had been buzzing continuously for the last hour, Kevin with bored messages, Chloe with increasingly frantic texts, 2 numbers he didn't recognize that were almost certainly journalists, and one from his PR director that simply read, "We need to talk. Now, please." He pulled out the phone and looked at the messages without reading them, and then put it face down on the counter. "What does she actually have?" he asked. "In terms of legal leverage, walk me through the worst case." Arthur took a breath. "The worst case. She holds majority IP rights to the Apex chip through the trust's escalated equity position. Without licensing from the trust from her Sterling Enterprises, cannot legally manufacture, sell, or license the Apex product line. The Apex chip is your flagship product. It accounts for approximately 63% of your current revenue." 63, Marcus repeated. "Without it, the company's valuation drops significantly, enough to trigger several of your loan covenants with the bank, which would accelerate repayment on approximately $240 million in outstanding credit, which the company currently does not have liquid." Marcus turned from the window. "She could collapse the company." "Not immediately. There are legal processes, timelines, appeal mechanisms. But yes, if she chose to exercise her rights in full, she could initiate a cascade that would be very difficult to stop. And the baby." Marcus's voice changed slightly on those 2 words, shifted in register. "The baby is my child. She can't take the company and the child." "Those are 2 separate legal matters," Arthur said. "The custody situation will depend on—" "She's 6 weeks from her due date," Marcus said. "She's somewhere out there alone, 6 weeks away from delivering, and she has engineered the complete destruction of my professional life with the same precision that she—" He stopped himself. The sentence was going somewhere he wasn't ready for it to go. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then gently, "Marcus, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In the time before Elena disappeared, the weeks, months before, was there anything she said or did that in hindsight might have been a signal? Something you dismissed at the time?" The question hung in the kitchen. Marcus thought about it. He tried to approach it honestly, which was difficult because honesty with himself was a muscle he had allowed to atrophy significantly over the years. He thought about Elena at the dinner table in the evenings, how she had stopped asking him about his day sometime in the past year, not angrily, just quietly, the way someone stops watering a plant that isn't growing. He thought about how she had taken to reading in the study rather than the living room, how she had started having her prenatal appointments alone after the first few, how she had stopped mentioning Chloe's name, despite the fact that Marcus was now almost certain she had known about Chloe for considerably longer than he had understood. He thought about one specific evening 3 months ago when he had come home to find her sitting at the desk in the study with a stack of files in front of her, thick files, legal-looking, and he had looked in through the open door and asked what she was doing, and she had looked up at him with that calm, unreadable expression and said, "Just organizing some things." And he had nodded and walked away because he had not been even slightly curious about what things she was organizing, because Elena's things had never struck him as worth being curious about. "No," he told Arthur. And it was the most dishonest, true answer he had ever given because the signals had been everywhere. He simply hadn't been paying enough attention to someone he had decided didn't matter. His phone buzzed again. He looked at it reflexively. It was a news alert. The headline read, "Tech billionaire Marcus Sterling, named person of interest as pregnant wife, remains missing." He set the phone down very carefully, as if it were something that might break. "Arthur," he said, "I see it. I need to get ahead of this." "You need to not say a word to any media until we have a strategy," Arthur said immediately. "You are currently a person of interest in a disappearance investigation, a subject of a financial regulatory review, and a man whose company's ownership structure is about to become a matter of public record. You do not speak publicly, not yet. If I don't speak, it looks like guilt. If you speak incorrectly, it becomes guilt." Arthur gathered the documents into a neat stack. "Give me 24 hours. Let me get a full picture of the trust documentation. Let me make contact with whoever is representing Elena's interests and mark as she has representation. Someone filed that trust dissolution this morning. Someone drafted those documents. There is an attorney on her side of this, and I need to know who they are before you do anything." Marcus nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. "One more thing," Arthur said, and his voice dropped slightly, carrying the specific gravity of a man who has saved the most important item for last. "The letter." Marcus looked up. The trust dissolution filing included a personal letter, addressed to you, submitted through legal channels, which means it's on record. Arthur reached into his briefcase and set a single folded page on the table between them. "I haven't read it. I want you to read it first." Marcus looked at the folded page for a long moment. Then he picked it up and opened it. Elena's handwriting. Precise, unhurried, the same handwriting he had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards, and the small notes she used to leave him in the early years of their marriage, before the notes had stopped and he hadn't noticed. "Marcus," it began, "I want to be very careful with these words because I want you to understand them exactly as I mean them. This is not a letter of anger. Anger requires the belief that things could have been different. I stopped believing that a long time ago. What I built for us. At the beginning, I believed in you completely, not in your ambition, which was always obvious, but in the person underneath it. I believed there was a man in there who was capable of seeing other people. I was wrong, or you changed, and eventually the distinction stopped mattering. I know about Chloe. I have known for 14 months. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. 14 months of watching you choose her, watching you treat me as invisible, watching you look through me the way you look through a window, aware I'm there only when there's something on the other side worth seeing. The company is not yours in the way you believe. It never was. I made it possible, and I made it possible without conditions because I loved you, and because I believed in what we were building together. That belief is gone. What happens next is up to you, not to your lawyers, not to your board. You. You will make a choice about what kind of man you are, and that choice will determine whether our son ever knows his father as something other than a cautionary tale. I am not your enemy, but I am done being invisible. Elena. Marcus set the letter down on the table. He sat very still for a long time. Arthur did not speak. He understood in the way that good attorneys understand that some moments require the absence of words. Finally, Marcus said, "She knows it's a boy." His voice was not the voice of the man who had walked into boardrooms and reshaped industries and been photographed for the covers of magazines. It was something older and smaller and stripped of everything that had been layered on top of it over the years. "She knows it's a boy," he said again, "and she didn't tell me." He picked up his phone. There were 37 notifications. He ignored all of them and opened the voicemail from the unknown number, Elena's number, the one she had called from the night before, and played her message again. And this time, standing in his kitchen with the letter in front of him and the full weight of what she had built, pressing down from every direction, he listened to her voice differently. Not as something to decode or dismiss or manage. As a woman, he had spent years not hearing, finally speaking at full volume, in the only language he had ever truly respected, the language of power. His phone buzzed one final time. A text from Kevin Board called emergency meeting. 2 hours. They want you there. And Sir Chloe gave an interview. Marcus read the text twice. He thought about Chloe, who had called the office that morning asking about journalists, who had texted him "call me now" in capital letters, who had apparently made the decision that in the absence of Marcus Sterling being useful to her, she would make herself useful to someone else. He thought about Elena, who had known about Chloe for 14 months and had said nothing done, nothing visible, while underneath the surface she had been quietly, methodically, and with extraordinary patience building the mechanism of her departure. He thought about his son, a word he was only now fully understanding, who was 6 weeks away from being born into a world where his father had already lost almost everything that defined him. He stood up, straightened his jacket out of pure muscle memory, and looked at Arthur. "Get me everything on Gerald Webb," he said. "Every case he touched for my company, every document he signed. If he was compromised, I want to know by whom and when and how much it cost." "And the board meeting?" Marcus picked up his phone. "I'll be there," he said. He walked toward the door and then he stopped with his hand on the frame because something had occurred to him, something small and specific that had been sitting at the edge of his awareness since he had walked into the nursery the night before and found it emptied. Elena had taken the mobile. The hanging mobile above the crib, the little wooden bird she had assembled herself on a Sunday afternoon while Marcus was on a conference call. She had taken it with her. Not the furniture, not the dresser she had built, not anything large or permanent, just the mobile, the small, carefully made personal thing. He stood there with his hand on the doorframe and felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since the age of 7, standing in a driveway in front of a house that suddenly meant something different. He felt grief, not for the company, not for the public humiliation that was already beginning to materialize in the form of 37 notifications and a board emergency and Chloe's interview. For the woman who had loved him enough to fund an empire and quiet enough to disappear from it without a sound, and who had taken nothing with her except a small wooden mobile she had made with her own hands for a son Marcus hadn't known was a son. He walked out the door. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock. Marcus arrived at 11:45. He did it deliberately, arriving early to a room where people expected to have time to prepare their positions before he walked in to find their footing to coordinate the particular blend of concern and accusation that a board assembles when it senses blood in the water. He had used this tactic before arriving early to disrupt the equilibrium of people who needed extra time to feel powerful. He walked through the Sterling Enterprises lobby with his jaw set and his posture controlled and his eyes forward, and the people he passed in the hallway either looked away or said, "Good morning," too quickly, which told him everything he needed to know about what was being said in offices and break rooms and group chats that he wasn't part of. Kevin fell into step beside him without being asked. "Chloe's interview went live at 10, Kevin said, keeping his voice low and walking fast. "It's a lifestyle site. She framed it as she called herself a close personal friend who was concerned about your well-being. She didn't name herself as anything more than that, but she posted a photo on her own account 20 minutes later that made the subtext fairly explicit." "How bad?" Marcus said. "The comments are bad. The pickup is worse. 3 major outlets have already referenced it, and the phrase they keep using is..." Kevin hesitated. "That you may have had motivation." "To harm my wife." "Yes." Marcus pushed through the door to the executive floor and didn't slow down. "Get me the interview link, and get Vera on the phone." Vera Moss was his public relations director, a woman who had spent 20 years specializing in the kind of crises that could not be explained away and therefore had to be carefully contextualized. She picked up before Kevin had finished dialing. "I've been waiting 2 hours for this call," she said, skipping the greeting entirely, which was how Marcus knew she was genuinely alarmed rather than professionally alarmed. "Tell me what we're doing," Marcus said. "What we're not doing is anything reactive," Vera said immediately. "No statements, no social, no press access. What we are doing is drafting a written response through your attorney's office that expresses concern for Elena's safety and establishes your full cooperation with the investigation. Clean, human, nothing defensive." "The financial story is going to break," Marcus said. "The regulatory filing is on record. Someone is going to connect it." "I know. When they do, the narrative shifts from missing wife to defrauded husband to whatever they decide to make it." "I know," Vera said again. "Marcus, I need you to tell me something, and I need the actual truth, not the version you've decided to give the detectives. Did you know about the Orion Trust's ownership position before this morning?" The hallway was empty. Marcus stopped walking. "No," he said. A pause on Vera's end. "Okay, that's workable, actually. That's better than the alternative." "How is that better?" Because the alternative is that you knew your wife owned the majority of your intellectual property and you were having an affair anyway, which would make you look either spectacularly arrogant or genuinely sociopathic, neither of which plays well with a missing pregnant woman as the backdrop. Vera's voice was brisk and precise. The version where you didn't know where you've spent years, unaware that the woman you were dismissing was also the woman holding the entire enterprise together. That's a different story. It's humiliating, but humiliation is survivable. The other thing isn't. Marcus started walking again. Draft the statement. Run it by Arthur before it goes anywhere. He ended the call and walked into the boardroom. There were 7 board members. 4 of them were already seated, which told him they had also come early, which meant Kevin's estimate of the situation had been accurate, they had coordinated. The other 3 filed in over the next 4 minutes with the careful nonchalance of people trying to appear as though they had not been standing just outside the door waiting. Richard Hale sat at the far end of the table. Richard was the oldest member of the board, a 71-year-old with the permanently suspicious expression of a man who had watched too many founders believe their own mythology. He had been skeptical of Marcus from the beginning and had voted against him in 3 separate board decisions, always in the minority, always with the patient conviction of someone who expects to be vindicated eventually. He was looking at Marcus now with something that was not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. "Thank you for coming in," Richard said as if Marcus were a guest. "It's my company," Marcus said, sitting down. "Let's not waste time." Thomas Briggs. The board chair cleared his throat. He was a former investment banker who defaulted to financial language in moments of emotional difficulty, which Marcus had always found useful and was now finding irritating. "Marcus, we want to start by expressing the board's concern for Elena and for the situation. I appreciate that," Marcus said. "What else?" Briggs shifted. "The regulatory filing this morning has raised some significant questions about the ownership structure of Sterling Enterprises, specifically around the Apex chip IP. Our legal team has been reviewing the documentation since 9 o'clock, and I know what you found," Marcus said, "because it's the same thing I found, this morning, for the first time." The room went quiet in a way that had texture to it. "You're telling us," Richard Hale said slowly, "that you were unaware of the Orion Trust's equity position." "That is exactly what I'm telling you. For 6 years. For 6 years. Richard leaned back in his chair and looked at Marcus with an expression that was not unkind and was not kind. "Marcus, either you are telling the truth, in which case someone ran an extraordinarily sophisticated deception inside your own company, or you are not telling the truth, in which case this conversation has very different implications. You understand the position we're in?" "I understand it perfectly," Marcus said. "My wife, the woman who is currently missing, who is 6 weeks from delivering our child, was the hidden beneficial owner of the Orion Trust. She funded the early development of this company through that trust before we were married. She structured an equity agreement that escalated with every Apex milestone, and she has now formally exercised that ownership position." He let that sit for a moment. "I did not know," he said. "My previous attorney, Gerald Webb, approved the original documentation. I am currently pursuing that angle with Arthur Voss. But I want to be completely clear with this board about what we are facing, not because I'm asking for sympathy, but because you need accurate information to make decisions about this company." Thomas Briggs leaned forward. "What exactly are we facing in concrete terms?" "Without a licensing agreement with the Orion Trust with Elena, we cannot legally continue manufacturing or selling the Apex line. That triggers the bank covenants, which accelerates the credit, which we cannot service in the short term without significant asset restructuring." The room absorbed this. "How long do we have?" someone asked from the left side of the table. Daniel Park, the youngest board member, the one who always asked the question that everyone else was thinking, but framing more diplomatically. "Arthur estimates 60 to 90 days before the covenant triggers become unavoidable," Marcus said. "Assuming Elena doesn't accelerate the timeline by licensing the IP to a competitor." "Can she do that?" Briggs asked. "She owns it," Marcus said simply. "She can do whatever she wants with it." Richard Hale spoke again. His voice was quiet and steady and carried the particular authority of a man who had been waiting a long time to say the next thing he was about to say. "Marcus, I've sat on this board for 9 years, In that time, I have watched you build something genuinely extraordinary. I've also watched you treat this company like a personal instrument and treat the people around you, including some of the people in this room, as secondary to your own priorities. And he paused. I am not saying this to be cruel. I am saying it because I think you need to hear it from someone who has been watching, and because I think what happened this morning is not entirely surprising to anyone who is paying attention to the whole picture. The room was very still. Marcus looked at Richard Hale for a long moment. He thought about the 11 years he had spent dismissing Richard's caution as the reflex of a man too afraid to take risks. He thought about the meetings where he had overridden Richard's concerns with confidence and speed, and the particular kind of charm that makes people doubt their own judgment. "You're right," Marcus said. The two words landed like something dropped from a height. Richard blinked. "You're right," Marcus said again. "And we can discuss the implications of that in depth later. Right now, I need this board to authorize a 30-day operational continuity plan that protects employees and preserves the company's position while my legal team attempts to open dialogue with Elena's representatives." The meeting went for another 90 minutes. By the end of it, the continuity plan had been authorized by a 5-2 vote Richard Hale and one other voting in favor, the remaining two abstaining, which Marcus noted and would not forget. But the authorization had passed, which was what mattered. It bought time. In Marcus's experience, time was the one resource that could be converted into anything else if used correctly. He was walking back to his car at 3:45 when Kevin caught up to him with a look on his face that Marcus had learned to recognize as the precursor to information that was going to require sitting down to receive. "Tell me," Marcus said without stopping. "The Detective Ramirez called while you were in the meeting. They've located Elena's phone. Or rather what's left of it. It was found in a dumpster near the gas station, wiped and smashed. No recoverable data." Marcus stopped walking. "They're classifying it as deliberate destruction of a personal device, which combined with the staged blood evidence, they're now saying the blood in the car has been tested, and it's animal blood, not human, means they're formally reclassifying the missing persons case." "Reclassifying it how?" Marcus said. Kevin hesitated for precisely the length of time it takes a person to find a careful way of saying something they know is going to land hard. They're treating it as a voluntary disappearance, which means they're scaling back the active investigation. Marcus stood there in the parking structure and let that sentence move through him. Animal blood, her phone destroyed, the tracking disabled, the nursery cleared out, the legal filing submitted before dawn, 14 months of planning all of it, converging on a single night. "She wasn't taken," Marcus said. "No," Kevin said. "She walked out." "Yes." "She staged the blood so that I would panic, so that I would call the police, so that it would become public immediately before I had any time to—" He stopped. "Before I had any time to control the narrative." Kevin said nothing, which was the right response. Marcus started walking again. "Get me Arthur. And Kevin, pull every public statement I have made in the last 3 years that mentions Elena. Interviews, keynotes, profiles, anything. I want to see every single time I referenced her and what I said." He already knew what he was going to find. He knew before Kevin nodded and pulled out his phone. He had spent 3 years in the public eye as a singular genius, a self-made visionary, a man who had built something from nothing through his own brilliance and will, and in all of that time, in all of those interviews and profiles and keynote addresses he had mentioned Elena, the way you mentioned furniture. She was there, she was supportive, she was expecting, she was lovely. He had never once in 3 years of public statements credited her with anything. He reached his car and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. He pulled up his phone and opened the news alerts he had been ignoring since morning. The headlines had shifted over the course of the day in exactly the direction Vera had predicted, from missing wife to questions about the company, to finally the story that some financial reporter had clearly been handed on a silver platter by someone who understood exactly how the timing worked. The headline read, "Who really built Sterling Enterprises, the anonymous investor behind the Apex chip?" The article was thorough. Too thorough for a reporter who had started from scratch that morning. Someone had briefed them, had walked them through the Orion Trust structure with enough detail that the piece read not like investigative journalism, but like a prepared brief delivered to a sympathetic outlet. Elena's name was not in the article. The trust's beneficiary information was technically still protected pending the legal process, but the implication was visible through the careful language like a shape through fog. Marcus read it twice. Then he called Arthur. "You've seen it," Arthur said. "Who briefed them? Almost certainly the same attorney who filed the trust dissolution. This was coordinated, Marcus. The regulatory filing, the timing of the disappearance, the police report, the media brief, these didn't happen simultaneously by accident." "She has a team," Marcus said. "Not just a lawyer, a team." "A very good one. Whoever structured this understood the legal process, the media cycle, the financial regulatory timeline, and the public narrative. They hit all four simultaneously. By the time you woke up this morning, all four of those things were already in motion." Marcus pressed his palm flat against the steering wheel. "She planned this for how long?" Given the complexity of the equity escalation provisions and the trust dissolution timing, and this is just my read, I think the structural plan was in place for at least 2 years. The execution plan, the disappearance, the staging, the media coordination, I think that layer was added more recently, probably within the last year. 14 months. I know about Chloe. I have known for 14 months. "She started the execution layer when she found out about Chloe," Marcus said. Arthur was quiet for a beat. "That's my read too." Marcus sat in the car and looked at nothing. He thought about Elena sitting across from him at dinner 3 months ago, asking him to pass the salt with the same calm expression she always wore while somewhere on her phone or in a file on her desk. The plan that was now consuming his life was sitting in an advanced stage of completion. He thought about how many times in those 14 months he had looked at her and seen nothing of interest, nothing worth a second glance, nothing that required his real attention. He thought about the fact that she had let him look at her that way, had let him see nothing, had counted on it. His phone rang. Unknown number. He stared at it for 3 full seconds, then answered. "Marcus." Elena's voice. Calm as always, but closer somehow than the voicemail. More immediate. He did not trust himself to speak first, so he didn't. "I know you've read the letter," she said. "I know Arthur has the documents. I know you've talked to the board, and I know what they authorized, because the continuity plan your board approved this afternoon needs my representative's sign-off to have any legal effect, which means you need me." "Where are you?" he said. His voice came out flatter than he intended. "Safe, healthy. The baby is fine." A small pause. "His name is going to be Noah." Noah. He hadn't known it was a boy, and he hadn't known they had a name, and both of those facts hit him at different angles simultaneously. One of them purely informational, and one of them something else entirely. "Elena," he said. "I'm not calling to negotiate," she said. "Not yet. I'm calling because there's one more thing you need to know before the rest of this plays out, and I think you deserve to hear it from me directly rather than from a news alert." "What?" he said. "In 48 hours, I am releasing a full statement through my legal team. It will confirm my identity as the Orion Trust beneficiary. It will outline the equity structure of Sterling Enterprises in full, and it will include the documentation of your affair, including dates, financial transfers, and the offshore account you set up in October." Marcus closed his eyes. "I'm not releasing it to hurt you," she said, and her voice remained steady in a way that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. "I'm releasing it because the public record needs to be accurate, because the story that has been told about Sterling Enterprises, the story of one brilliant man building something from nothing, is not true, and I am not willing to let that story stand as fact." "You'll destroy everything," he said. "I'm correcting the record," she said. "What you do in response to that correction is your choice. It has always been your choice." A brief silence. "Marcus, when the statement goes public, you will have approximately 4 hours before the narrative is completely beyond your control. In those 4 hours, you can either get ahead of it or be buried by it. I suggest you think carefully about which one you want." "You're giving me a window," he said slowly. "You're telling me in advance so that I have a window." "I'm giving you the same thing I always gave you," she said, "an opportunity that you're free to ignore." The line went quiet, And then it was gone, and Marcus sat in the car alone with the silence pressing in from every direction, and he thought about 48 hours, and he thought about a 4-hour window, and he thought about the word opportunity spoken by a woman who had spent 6 years making his success possible and 14 months engineering its conditional survival. He thought about his son, whose name was Noah, who was 6 weeks from being born into a world that was currently deciding what kind of man his father was. Marcus started the car. He called Vera Moss. "I need to go public," he said when she answered. "Before the 48-hour mark. I need to get ahead of a statement that is coming out from Elena's team." Vera's voice shifted into a different register, the one she used when the situation had moved from difficult to historic. "How much are you prepared to say?" Marcus looked straight ahead through the windshield. "Everything," he said. Vera was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Then we need to move fast," she said, "because everything is going to take every minute of the time you have." He pulled out of the parking structure into the gray afternoon, and for the first time since he had come home to an empty house the night before, Marcus Sterling had a direction. It wasn't a good direction, it wasn't a comfortable one, but it was the only honest one available to him, which was something he had not been able to say about any of his directions for a very long time. 48 hours. He pressed the accelerator and drove. Vera Moss had managed 23 public crises in her career. She had guided a senator through a corruption scandal, a pharmaceutical CEO through a wrongful death lawsuit, and a Hollywood producer through allegations that had ended 3 other careers in the same industry. She was not a woman who used the word unprecedented lightly, because in her experience, almost nothing was truly unprecedented. Most disasters followed recognizable patterns, and recognizable patterns had recognizable solutions. She used the word now. "This is unprecedented," she told Marcus at 4:30 in the afternoon, sitting across from him in the conference room of Arthur's law firm with a legal pad in front of her and nothing written on it yet. Not the affair, not the financial structure, not even the disappearance, the combination, the sequencing. The fact that your wife apparently designed the exposure of this story with the same level of strategic precision that most communications professionals spend their entire careers trying to achieve. She looked at him steadily. "She's better at this than most people I've worked with." "I know," Marcus said, "which means anything we do in response is going to be measured against someone who has already anticipated our response." Vera tapped the end of her pen against the table. "So, what are you actually prepared to say?" Marcus had been thinking about this for the 40 minutes it had taken him to get from the parking structure to Arthur's office. He had thought about it through the drive, and through the elevator, and through the hallway, and by the time he sat down across from Vera, he had arrived at something that surprised him, not a strategy exactly, something simpler and considerably more dangerous. "The truth," he said. Vera looked at him the way doctors look at patients who suggest their own diagnosis. "Define that." "Everything Elena's statement is going to say, I say it first. I confirm the affair. I confirm that I was unaware of the Orion Trust's ownership position, and I explain what that means for the company. I address the investigation, confirm she is safe, and that her disappearance was voluntary, and He stopped for a beat. "I acknowledge that the story that has been told about Sterling Enterprises is incomplete." "Incomplete," Vera repeated. "That she was a significant contributor to its success, that I did not adequately recognize that contribution, that I intend to correct the record." Vera was quiet for a long moment. "You understand that what you're describing is not spin. It's not damage control. What you're describing is a public confession." "I know. Those don't usually go well." "They go better than the alternative," Marcus said. "If Elena's statement drops first, I'm reacting. If I go first, I'm at least choosing what I look like while the building falls." Arthur, who had been sitting at the end of the table saying nothing, spoke for the first time. "There's also the legal dimension to consider. A public acknowledgement of the affair creates potential exposure in the divorce proceedings, and acknowledging the company's ownership structure before the regulatory review concludes, I know the risks," Marcus said. "I need to make sure—" "Arthur," Marcus looked at him. "I spent 14 months being watched by a woman who was deciding whether the man she married still existed underneath everything he'd become. She decided he didn't. And she was right." He paused. I'm not doing this for the legal strategy. I'm doing it because my son is going to be born in 6 weeks, and I would like him to grow up knowing that when his father was given one chance to do the right thing under pressure, he actually did it. The conference room was very quiet. Vera wrote something on her legal pad, then she looked up. "Okay," she said. "Then we do it right. We do it tonight. Live not a statement, a live address. Direct camera, no moderator, no filter. You speak for 15 minutes, and you don't use notes." "Tonight," Marcus said. "If we wait until tomorrow, the 48-hour window starts closing. Elena's team could move their timeline up the moment they see you going public. We need to be live before anyone has time to react." She glanced at Arthur. "Can you have a legal clearance on the language within 3 hours?" "If Marcus tells me now exactly what he's planning to say," Arthur said. Marcus nodded. "Then let's start." They worked for 3 hours straight. Marcus talked, and Arthur refined, and Vera shaped. And between them they built something that was not quite a speech, and not quite a statement, and not quite a confession. It was something Marcus had never given in his professional life, which was a plain account of what had happened without the editorial layer of image management on top of it. Every time Vera tried to soften a phrase, Marcus pushed back. Every time Arthur suggested a qualification, Marcus considered it and kept only the ones that were legally necessary rather than the ones that made him sound better. At 7:45, Kevin set up a camera in Arthur's corner office. At 8:02, Marcus Sterling went live. He did not begin with the affair. He began with Sterling Enterprises. He began with the early years, the whiteboards and the borrowed money, and the desperate optimism of a man who was building something he believed in with resources he didn't have. He talked about the Orion Trust in the same plain language that Arthur had cleared, acknowledging the investment, acknowledging the equity structure, acknowledging that he had not fully understood the documentation he had signed, and that this was his failure, not a deception he was the victim of. He said those words carefully and clearly, his failure. Then he talked about Elena. He said her name the way you say something you have been holding in your mouth for too long and finally have to swallow or release. He said it, and then he kept going, and what came out was not the polished tribute of a man performing contrition. It was something rawer and less comfortable than that. He said that she had been present at the beginning of everything he had built, and that he had treated her presence as background. He said that she had contributed in ways he had not recognized, and had not tried to recognize because recognizing her contribution would have required him to share credit he had decided was entirely his. He said that the story of Sterling Enterprises, as he had told it in every interview and keynote and investor presentation for 6 years, was incomplete, and that the incompleteness was deliberate, and that he was correcting it now. He paused. He said he had been unfaithful. He said it once directly without the passive language that public figures routinely use to acknowledge affairs, not "there were mistakes," or "I failed to honor my commitment." But the plain declarative sentence he had been unfaithful to his wife, deliberately and repeatedly, for over a year. The live viewer count was climbing fast. Kevin had set up a monitor at the edge of his eyeline, and Marcus had told him not to, but he could see it in his peripheral vision anyway. 50,000, then 90, then passing 120,000, and still climbing, which meant the clip was already being shared before it had ended. He didn't stop. He kept talking. He said that Elena's decision to leave had been her choice, and that it had been made clearly and deliberately, and that she was safe, and that the police investigation into her disappearance was being closed because there was no crime, only a woman who had made a decision she had every right to make. He said he was not asking for sympathy. He said he was asking in the most direct terms he could find for the record to be accurate. He said, "I am not the man Sterling Enterprises has said I am. I am a man who had an extraordinary amount of help that I did not acknowledge from a woman I did not value the way she deserved, and every success I have claimed as mine alone was built on a foundation she provided. That is the truth. That is the complete truth. And I am saying it publicly because she deserved to have it said publicly 6 years ago, and I was too arrogant to say it then." He stopped. The live count was at 460,000. He reached forward and ended the feed. The room was completely silent for a moment. Then Kevin's phone started ringing. Then Vera's. Then Arthur's. Marcus sat in the chair and looked at the dark camera lens and breathed. "How do you feel?" Vera asked quietly. Marcus thought about it honestly, the way he had been trying to think about things honestly for the past several hours. "Like I swallowed something that was stuck," he said. His own phone buzzed. A text from a number he recognized: Chloe. "I cannot believe you just did that. You just destroyed yourself on camera. You're insane." He looked at the text for a moment. Then he set the phone face down on the desk, the same way he had that morning, and did not pick it up again for 2 hours. What happened over those 2 hours was something Vera later described to her colleagues as one of the strangest things she had witnessed in 23 years of crisis communications. The initial wave of response was predictably mixed: outrage, mockery, sympathy, analysis, all running simultaneously in the chaotic register of social media, absorbing a major story in real time. But within 90 minutes, something shifted in the current, the way currents sometimes shift when a significant enough weight moves in a consistent direction. People started responding not to the confession, but to the specificity of it, to the fact that he had said her name without softening it, to the fact that he had said his failure rather than our failure or circumstances led to the fact that he had said she deserved to have it said publicly 6 years ago, with the particular crack in his voice that happens when a person is not performing an emotion, but actually experiencing it in front of strangers. It was not forgiveness, it was not rehabilitation, but it was something that Marcus had not expected and had not planned for. It was the beginning of a conversation that was about something real rather than something managed, and that realness had a quality that managed things never quite achieve. At 10:15, Arthur came into the office with a piece of paper. "Elena's attorney called," he said. Marcus looked up. "They've seen the address. Her team watched it in full." Arthur set the paper on the desk. "They're postponing the public statement." Marcus stared at him. "Postponing? Indefinitely. For now." Arthur sat down. Her attorney said, and I'm quoting directly because the phrasing matters, that his client felt the public record had been adequately corrected for the immediate term, and that further disclosure from their side was not necessary at this time. The room absorbed that. "She saw it," Marcus said, "evidently. And she's standing down. For now," Arthur said carefully. "That's not forgiveness, Marcus. That's not reconciliation. It's a tactical withdrawal, and it could resume at any point." "I know," Marcus said. But something in his chest had shifted. Not relief exactly, but the specific absence of a pressure that had been sitting there since 8 o'clock the previous evening, when he had walked into an empty house and felt the silence press against his ears. He picked up his phone. He looked at the notifications, hundreds of them now still accumulating, and scrolled past all of them until he reached the text from Chloe that he had set aside 2 hours earlier. He read it again. "You just destroyed yourself on camera. You're insane." He typed back, "I think we both know this is over. I hope you find what you're looking for." He sent it and set the phone down and did not feel the things he had expected to feel. Not loss, not regret for the relationship, not the particular ache of an ending. What he felt instead was something closer to clarity, the kind that comes when you stop maintaining a lie and the energy that maintained it becomes available for other things. At 11:45, his bank called. He had been expecting this call since morning had mentally filed it in the category of things that were coming regardless of what he did. The representative he spoke to was senior and careful, and delivered the information with the practiced neutrality of someone conveying consequences rather than making judgments given the regulatory review and the uncertainty around the Apex IP ownership. The bank was formally issuing a covenant watch notice. Not an acceleration, not yet. A warning. A signal that the clock Marcus had known was running since morning was now visible to everyone. He thanked the representative and ended the call. Kevin was standing in the doorway. "The board chair called while you were on with the bank." "What did Briggs want?" He watched the address. He said, Kevin glanced at his notes. He said it was not what he expected and that he'd be in touch tomorrow. "What does that mean?" "I think it means he doesn't know yet," Kevin said honestly, "and he's one of the few people tonight who is actually admitting that." Marcus almost smiled. Almost. He stood up, stretched the kind of stretch that comes from sitting under enormous weight for too many hours, and walked to the window. The city was dark and lit below him, indifferent and continuous in the way cities are when they contain too many individual disasters to register any single one of them for long. "Kevin," he said. "Sir, go home, I mean it. Take tomorrow morning off. Come in at noon." Kevin hesitated. "There's going to be significant incoming first thing." "I know. Noon." Kevin left. Arthur gathered his papers slowly, the deliberate tidiness of a man who processes difficult days through physical order. At the door, he paused. "Marcus, for whatever it's worth, what you did tonight took something that most people in your position don't have." "Don't," Marcus said. "I'm not flattering you. I'm noting it for the record because the record matters to me." Arthur picked up his briefcase. "Get some sleep." He left. Marcus sat alone in the office for a while. He looked at his phone one more time. No new messages from Elena's number, the one she had called from the unknown number that had existed for one call and then presumably been discarded. He understood that. He wasn't expecting another call. He wasn't expecting anything. He thought about Noah. The name landed differently every time he turned it over. Noah. A name she had chosen alone in whatever place she was staying, without asking him and without needing to. His son had a name, and he had learned it from a phone call, and the weight of that, the specific particular weight of being excluded from something as fundamental as the naming of your own child, settled somewhere in his chest that was separate from all the professional catastrophe and lived there quietly alongside it. He thought about the letter. What happens next is up to you, not to your lawyers, not to your board, you. He thought about the 4-hour window she had given him and how he had used it and what she had done in response. She had seen him do the one thing she had probably not allowed herself to fully expect him to do, and her response had been to stand down. Not to forgive, not to return, but to stop the next wave. It was not nothing. His phone rang, not a number he recognized. He almost didn't answer. Then he did. "Mr. Sterling." A man's voice. Calm professional with the measured cadence of someone who speaks carefully by habit. "My name is Julian Cross." Marcus went very still. Julian Cross, 44 years old, the founder and CEO of CrossTech, the only tech company in the Pacific Northwest that had ever been positioned as a genuine rival to Sterling Enterprises. A man Marcus had publicly dismissed in 3 separate interviews as derivative reactive and congenitally incapable of original thinking. A man who had responded to each of those dismissals with a silence that Marcus had read as weakness. "I watched your address tonight," Julian said. "Most people did," Marcus said. "I wanted to call personally," Julian said, "because what I have to say isn't something I wanted communicated through attorneys or press releases." Marcus waited. "I've been in contact with Elena's legal team," Julian said. "Not recently. This is something that began approximately 4 months ago at her initiation. I want you to know that because I think you deserve to know the full timeline. 4 months. While she was still in the house, while Marcus was still coming home late and not seeing her and signing documents that redirected money to Chloe's private account." "What kind of contact?" Marcus said, keeping his voice flat. "She approached me about a potential acquisition of the Apex IP licensing rights," Julian said. "Specifically, the possibility of CrossTech becoming the primary licensee for the Apex product line in the event that the Orion Trust exercised its ownership position." The room seemed to compress slightly. "She was building the exit and the next chapter simultaneously," Marcus said. "That's an accurate description," Julian said. "And I want to be clear, I said yes. I've been in dialogue with her team since then, and we have a framework agreement. If the Orion Trust proceeds with full IP transfer, CrossTech will be the acquiring entity." Marcus breathed. "I'm not calling to gloat," Julian said, and his voice carried something that was not warmth exactly, but was not coldness either. It was the register of a man who has won something and knows that gloating about it diminishes it. "I'm calling because I've been where you are, not this specifically, but close enough. And I think you did something tonight that matters, and I wanted to say so directly, man to man, before the lawyers make everything formal and impersonal." Marcus said nothing for a long moment. "Why does it matter to you?" he finally asked. Julian was quiet for a beat. "Because Elena asked me to call you," he said. "She asked me to tell you that she watched tonight. All of it. And that she heard you." The words hit Marcus somewhere he had not been protecting. She watched. She heard him. "Is she—" he started, and his voice broke slightly on the word, and he did not try to recover it. "Is she all right?" "She's well," Julian said. "The baby is well. She asked me to tell you that also." "Tell her." Marcus stopped. "Tell her I got her letter. Tell her I understood it." "I will," Julian said. The call ended. Marcus sat in the dark office with the city below him and the silence of the building around him, and he thought about Elena watching the address on whatever device she had, in whatever place she had gone to, watching him stand in front of 400,000 people and say her name the way it should have been said years ago. And he thought about the fact that she had sent Julian Cross to call him not as a final blow, but as something else, as an acknowledgement, as proof that she had seen it. It was not forgiveness. It was not a door opening. But it was a woman who had every reason to look away, choosing just once more to look. Marcus stayed in that chair for a long time. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out into the night to begin the long work of becoming someone his son might someday recognize as a man worth knowing. 5 years is a long time to become unrecognizable to yourself. Marcus Sterling learned this not in a single moment, but in the accumulated weight of 5 years of smaller moments. The morning he handed over the last of his company's assets to the bank's receivership team and signed his name at the bottom of a document that officially ended Sterling Enterprises as a legal entity. The afternoon he moved out of the house and into a 2-bedroom apartment that cost less per month than he used to spend on client dinners. The first day he showed up at a sales job at a mid-level technology distribution company called Meridian Tech and introduced himself to his new manager, a 29-year-old named Derek, who had never heard of Marcus Sterling and did not particularly need to. Derek had shaken his hand and said, "Great to have you on the team," with the distracted warmth of someone already thinking about the next thing on his list. And Marcus had said, "Thank you, glad to be here," and had meant neither part of that sentence fully, and had gone to his desk and opened his laptop and begun learning the company's sales software with the same focused attention he had once applied to billion-dollar acquisition strategies. That moment, that specific small carpeted fluorescent lit moment, was the one Marcus returned to most often in the years that followed when he was trying to understand where the turn had happened. Not the public confession, not the bank call, not even Elena's letter. The moment Derek shook his hand and looked through him the way Marcus had spent years looking through Elena, and Marcus had stood there on the receiving end of that particular brand of invisibility and understood, in his body rather than his mind, what it actually felt like. It felt like nothing. That was the thing that stayed with him. Not pain, nothing. Like being a piece of furniture in a room full of people who had somewhere more important to be. He had carried that feeling carefully for 5 years, like something he wasn't ready to put down yet because putting it down would mean it had finished teaching him. The Meridian Tech Regional Sales Conference was held annually in Portland, and in the 5th year after the collapse of Sterling Enterprises, it coincided with the Pacific Northwest Technology Summit, the largest tech industry gathering on the West Coast. The kind of event that occupied 3 convention floors and required a separate badge system and had its own media credential process and was attended by the people who now ran the industry that Marcus had once believed he was the center of. Marcus was at the conference to staff a booth. Meridian Tech had a modest exhibit presence at the summit's vendor floor, a 12-by-12 space with a banner and 2 demo tablets and a bowl of branded pens that people took without stopping, and Marcus had been assigned to it along with a colleague named Priya because the 2 of them were the senior members of the Pacific Northwest sales team. Senior in this context meaning they had been there the longest and were trusted not to embarrass the company. He was explaining the company's enterprise software package to a facilities manager from a logistics company in Tacoma when he heard the sound change in the room. It was not a dramatic change. It was the specific, subtle shift that happens in a large room when something significant enters it. A collective reorientation, a turning of heads, a ripple of attention moving through the crowd like wind through grass. Marcus had felt that ripple directed at himself once. He recognized it immediately, even though he was now on the wrong side of it. He looked up. Elena walked into the vendor floor at the center of a group of 7 people, 3 of whom Marcus recognized from their public profiles as senior executives at Orion Technologies, the company she had built in the 5 years since she had walked out of his life. The other 4 were assistants and security, moving with the coordinated ease of people who had learned to manage the logistics of a principal who attracted attention everywhere she went. Elena had always been striking. Marcus had known this the way you know facts about things you don't fully attend to as information, without weight. What he had not understood, or had not allowed himself to understand, was the difference between a woman who was striking and a woman who had grown fully into herself, who moved through a room as if the room had been waiting for her rather than the other way around. She wore that confidence the way she wore everything without announcing it, without performing it, simply as a quality of her presence that other people adjusted to rather than something she adjusted to other people. She was 38 years old. She was more herself than Marcus had ever seen her. Walking beside her, one hand loosely in hers, was a boy with dark hair and his mother's eyes, and a small badge clipped to his jacket that read Noah in block letters with a star sticker beside it that he had clearly put there himself. Marcus stopped talking mid-sentence. The facilities manager from Tacoma said something he didn't hear. Noah was 4 years old. Marcus had done the math 100 times. In 5 years had counted forward from the due date, the way you count towards something you cannot have, arriving at the same number every time and putting it down and picking it up again, because it was the one piece of arithmetic that never stopped mattering regardless of what else was happening. 4 years old, dark hair, Elena's eyes, a star sticker he had chosen himself. "Sir," the facilities manager said. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. He pulled his attention back with visible effort. "I apologize. Where were we?" He finished the conversation. He took the man's card. He said the right things in the right order, and he was professional and present. And then the man walked away, and Marcus stood at the edge of the Meridian Tech booth and looked across the vendor floor to where Elena was now standing at a podium that had been set up near the summit's main corridor, speaking to a small cluster of journalists with the relaxed authority of someone who had given 1,000 interviews and learned exactly how much of herself to offer and how much to keep. Priya appeared at his elbow. She was 26 and sharp and had no idea who Elena Sterling was because she had been in high school when the story broke and had not been paying attention to the tech industry at the time for obvious reasons. "Do you know her?" Priya asked, following his gaze. "You look like you know her." "I did once," Marcus said. "She's incredible," Priya said with the uncomplicated admiration of someone watching a person be excellent at something. "She was on the summit's morning panel. I watched it on the live stream from the booth. She talked for 40 minutes about ethical IP ownership, and she didn't use a single slide, just talked. The whole room was completely silent." Marcus looked at Priya. "Ethical IP ownership," he repeated. "She built Orion Technologies from a trust she'd had since before her first marriage," Priya said, with the confident authority of someone who had read 3 paragraphs about something and felt sufficiently informed. "There was some big scandal with her ex-husband, a tech company collapse, I think, something like that, but she just kept going. She sold the core IP to Crosstech for $1. $1. Can you imagine?" she said in an interview, that the price was symbolic, that some things aren't about money. Marcus looked back across the room. Elena had finished with the journalists. She was crouching down slightly now, saying something to Noah, who was pointing at something with the total body investment of a 4-year-old who has spotted something of enormous personal importance. Elena looked in the direction he was pointing and said something back, and Noah laughed a child's laugh, loud and unself-conscious, the kind that carries across rooms without effort. And Marcus heard it from 40 feet away and felt it land somewhere between his ribs like something small and precise. Julian Cross appeared from the left side of the group, falling into step beside Elena, with the easy familiarity of someone who had been doing so for long enough that it required no adjustment. He said something to Noah, and Noah immediately reached up and grabbed his hand, and Julian let him naturally without making anything of it. Marcus watched the 3 of them. He had thought in the early years after the collapse that the sight of Julian Cross with Elena would produce something in him, rage or grief or the specific corrosive burn of jealousy. He had braced for it the way you brace for a pain you've been told is coming. What he felt instead, watching them now, was something that surprised him entirely. It was recognition. Julian Cross had done the thing Marcus had spent years failing to do. He had seen Elena. He had looked directly at her and understood what he was looking at and had valued it without needing to be the center of it. He held Noah's hand like it was the most natural thing in the world, because for him, it was because he had been there from the beginning of Noah's life in the way that Marcus had forfeited the right to be. It was not envy exactly. It was the clear, cold recognition of the difference between what Julian was and what Marcus had been stated plainly, without the softening that self-protection usually adds to that kind of comparison. He turned back to the booth. He spent the next 40 minutes doing his job. He talked to 3 more potential clients, answered questions about the software package, handed out the branded pens, and was present in the way that he had learned to be present in the 5 years since presence had stopped being optional. Not the performed presence of a man managing his image, but the actual attention of a person who had decided that the people in front of him deserved to be seen regardless of what they could offer him. He was talking to a woman from a mid-size manufacturing company in Eugene when he felt someone stop behind him. Not a vague awareness, a specific physical certainty. The particular quality of a presence he had spent years trying not to think about. He finished his sentence. He turned around. Elena was standing 4 feet away from him. Alone, the group had moved ahead, and Noah was with Julian somewhere to the left, visible at the edge of Marcus's peripheral vision. She had stopped deliberately. She had chosen to stop. She looked at him. He looked at her. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and the convention floor moved and hummed around them, completely indifferent to the specific gravity of what was happening in this 4-foot radius. "Marcus," she said. Just his name. No tone attached to it. No warmth and no coldness. Just his name in her voice, spoken the way you say the name of something you have made your peace with. "Elena," he said. She looked at him with an expression that was not the expression he had imagined across 5 years of imagining this moment. He had imagined triumph in her face or distance, or the particular satisfied composure of a person watching a consequence they designed arrive on schedule. What he saw instead was something quieter and more final than any of those things. She was simply looking at him, clearly, without residue. "You look well," she said. "I'm not," he said. "But I'm better." Something shifted very slightly at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, an acknowledgement. "I heard you went to work in sales," she said. "Meridian Tech, regional sales." He said it without embarrassment, which was something that had taken him approximately 2 years to achieve, and which he now considered one of his actual accomplishments. "It's a good company, good people." "Good," she said, and she meant it. He could tell she meant it because Elena had never been able to perform meaning she didn't feel, which had been one of the things he had been too arrogant to notice when it was the most obvious fact about her. A pause. "I watched the address," she said. "The night you went live. I've watched it several times since." "I know," he said. "Julian told me you heard it." She nodded. "I needed to know if it was real," she said. "I wasn't sure that night. I was sure later." "What made you sure?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "You stopped," she said. "Afterward. You stopped trying to fix it. You stopped trying to reach me through attorneys, and you stopped trying to contest the IP transfer, and you stopped. You stopped performing the recovery and just let it be what it was." She looked at him evenly. That was real. The stopping was real. Marcus absorbed that. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You don't have to answer." She waited. "The mobile," he said. "The one from the nursery. The wooden birds." Something moved across her face. Quick, real. "You noticed?" she said. "I noticed the morning after," he said. "I've thought about it a lot. Why that and not something larger? Why that specifically?" Elena was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had a different quality, not softer exactly, but less managed, more direct. "Because I made it with my hands," she said, "on a Sunday afternoon while you were on a conference call. I made it because I wanted Noah to have something in his room that came from me directly, not from a store or a registry. And when I left, I took it because it was the only thing in that house that was entirely mine. Everything else, the furniture, the art, the kitchen I had designed, all of it was ours, or was the house's, or felt like it belonged to the life I was leaving. The mobile was just mine." She paused. "I wanted Noah to have it." Marcus nodded. He didn't trust himself to say anything for a moment. "Does he know?" he said finally. "Does Noah know who I am?" Elena looked at him for a long count. This was the question that mattered. Both of them knew it. "He knows his father's name," she said. "He knows that his father made serious mistakes and that his father stood up in front of a lot of people and told the truth about them, which is hard and which matters. He knows his father is working on becoming a better man." She paused. "He doesn't know you yet, but he knows of you. And what he knows is not something I've made ugly." The thing in Marcus's chest that had been compressed for 5 years loosened slightly. Not released compressed things don't release all at once, but loosened just enough. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me," she said. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for him. He deserves a complete picture of where he came from, and a complete picture includes the fact that his father is capable of growth. I won't take that from him." Her voice was firm and clear, and not unkind. "But Marcus knowing of you and knowing you are two different things. The second one is a conversation for the future, and it's not a conversation I'm ready to have today." "I know," he said. "But it's a conversation I'm not closing," she said. He looked at her. "You heard me," she said. "I'm not closing it." From 20 feet away, Noah said something loud and urgent to Julian, the way 4-year-olds say everything, and both Marcus and Elena instinctively looked in his direction. Noah was holding up a branded pen from somebody's booth blue with a light-up tip, with the expression of someone who has found actual treasure and needs witnesses immediately. Julian crouched down and examined the pen with the seriousness the moment required and said something that made Noah laugh again, that same full-body laugh carrying across the room. Marcus watched his son laugh. He watched it for as long as he could without it becoming something he had to look away from. Then Elena said quietly and without ceremony, "Take care of yourself, Marcus." He turned back to her. "You too," he said. She looked at him one final time, not with the indifference he had feared, not with the satisfaction he had dreaded, but with the clear-eyed, unhurried look of a woman who had settled every account and closed every outstanding debt and walked forward into her own life with nothing unresolved dragging behind her. Then she turned and walked back toward her group. She did not look back. Marcus stood at the edge of the Meridian Tech booth and watched her go. He watched Julian take Noah's hand again, and Noah immediately hold up the light-up pen to show him and Julian examining it with great ceremony, and Elena stepping back into the orbit of her team with the ease of someone who had learned to be completely at home in herself. He watched until they moved around the corner and out of his line of sight. Priya appeared at his elbow again. "Was that—" "Yes," Marcus said. "Did you just—" "Yes." Priya was quiet for a moment. "Then are you okay?" Marcus thought about it honestly, the way he had taught himself to think about things over 5 years of slow and unglamorous and genuinely difficult reconstruction. He thought about the apartment with the 2 bedrooms. He thought about Derek, who still did not know who Marcus used to be and treated him accordingly without deference, and how Marcus had come to prefer it. He thought about the sales calls and the franchise expos and the small dignities of doing ordinary work without the scaffolding of extraordinary wealth holding him up, and how the ground felt different when you were standing on it yourself. He thought about Noah, 4 years old, dark hair, a star sticker placed with great personal intentionality on a name badge, a laugh that carried. He thought about Elena saying, "It's a conversation I'm not closing." "Yeah," he said. "I think so." He turned back to the booth. There was someone waiting, a man in a gray jacket who had picked up one of the branded pens and was reading the company name on it with the patient, undecided expression of someone who might be interested if approached correctly. Marcus walked over to him and introduced himself and asked what kind of software challenges the man's company was currently dealing with, and actually listened to the answer, because Marcus Sterling had learned in 5 years what he had failed to learn in 42, that the people in front of you are always worth the full attention you have available, and that the life you build from the wreckage of the one you destroyed is built one honest conversation at a time. He didn't get the account that day. The man in the gray jacket took a pen and a brochure and said he'd be in touch, which in sales means maybe, which means probably not, and Marcus thanked him and meant it anyway. He packed up the Meridian Tech booth at 5 o'clock. folded the banner, collected the remaining pens, and carried the demo tablets in a bag over his shoulder through the convention center and out into the early evening air. One ordinary man at the end of an ordinary workday, invisible to everyone around him and entirely present to himself. He had lost an empire. He had lost a marriage he had never truly honored. He had lost the version of himself that a magazine once called a once-in-a-generation innovator, and that a woman with his son's eyes had funded and built and ultimately refused to let stand uncorrected. What Marcus Sterling had gained was something smaller and harder to name. Not redemption, because redemption is something other people grant and cannot be earned unilaterally, and he understood that now. What he had gained was the knowledge of exactly what he was stripped of, every layer of mythology and image and managed narrative, down to the plain and unadorned truth of a man who had been given extraordinary things and had failed to see them until they were gone. That knowledge was not comfortable, but it was his, entirely, completely, without anyone else's money or genius or invisible labor holding it up. He walked to his car, put the bag in the trunk, and sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. On his phone, one new message, a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. A photograph, no caption, no text, just a photograph. Noah grinning, holding up the light-up pen in one hand and giving an enormous, completely unself-conscious thumbs up with the other, looking directly at the camera with the specific, radiant confidence of a child who has never once been made to feel invisible. Marcus stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he set the phone on the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove home. Not to an empire, not to a dynasty, not to a life built on borrowed genius and uncredited love, but to a two-bedroom apartment and a life that was small and honest and entirely, finally his own. Some men lose everything and spend the rest of their lives pretending they didn't. Marcus Sterling lost everything and chose in the end to let the losing be the beginning. That was the only victory available to him, and he took it with both hands, and it was enough.